I had been planning this trip for months. I wanted to be alone in the wilderness, away from the city, the noise, the constant pressure of work and people. I had read about this particular camping spot tucked deep in the forest of the Northern Highlands. It wasn't a famous site, not on any tourist maps, but some online hikers had posted about it, and their photographs showed a river cutting through dense pine trees, wide clearings, and an old gravel path leading in and out. I told myself that this would be the perfect place to disconnect, to escape everything. I didn't realize how dangerous my desire for solitude could become. I packed my car with everything I thought I might need. A large backpack with enough food for 5 days, water bottles, a portable stove, cooking utensils, a sleeping bag, a heavy-duty tent, and a first aid kit. I even packed extra blankets, just in case it got cold at night. I loaded in a small hatchet, a flashlight with extra batteries, a map of the area, a compass, and a pocket knife. I felt prepared, almost over-prepared. My car had a full tank, and I double-checked the route, marking the entry point and the rough path I would take through the forest. I left my itinerary with a friend, giving them approximate times for check-ins, though I didn't plan to use my phone much. I wanted no distractions, no interruptions. I left the city at sunrise. The road climbed steadily into the hills, winding past fields and then forests that grew thicker and darker as I ascended. Birds called in the morning air, and the wind carried a crisp chill that hinted at the winter to come. I had driven for hours, and when the road finally ended at a small gravel pull-off, I parked, took a deep breath, and unloaded my pack. The gravel crunched under my boots as I shouldered it and began walking toward the forest. At first, the forest felt welcoming. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappled the forest floor, and made the shadows dance. I followed a narrow path that rose gently, littered with pine needles and fallen leaves. The air smelled of damp earth and resin. I walked slowly, listening to the soft rustle of wind in the trees, the distant sound of birds, and my own boots pressing into the soft forest floor. Every so often, I stopped to admire the view through gaps in the trees. Small waterfalls feeding into the river below, moss-covered rocks, and the bright, clear sky above. By mid-afternoon, I had hiked nearly 2 miles and found a clearing beside the river. It was perfect, a wide, flat area, shielded by tall pines on 3 sides, with the river flowing quietly nearby. I set up my tent, arranging the sleeping bag inside and laying down my gear. Then I collected firewood, carefully choosing dry branches from under fallen trees, arranging them in a neat pile near the clearing. By the time I had a small fire going, the sun was already beginning to drop toward the horizon. I ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread while watching the river shimmer in the fading light. The forest was starting to quiet as the day came to an end. Birds had gone silent, insects hummed faintly, and even the river seemed to slow in sound as the shadows lengthened. I felt a calm sense of accomplishment, sitting by the fire with the warmth against the cold air. I extinguished my stove, put away the food, and crawled into my sleeping bag as darkness fell. First, the night was peaceful. The stars emerged one by one, and the forest seemed to settle into its own rhythm. I had the flashlight on my side, the knife within reach, and a sense that I was exactly where I needed to be. But then I noticed it. A faint noise, almost imperceptible at first, like the crackle of twigs under heavy boots. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal, deer, maybe a fox. But a shiver ran down my spine as I realized the noise had come from outside the clearing, somewhere deeper in the trees. The night stretched on, and I tried to ignore it. I drifted in and out of sleep, my ears straining for every sound. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. A crunch followed by another, moving closer. My heart began to race. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in all directions, but the trees were dense, and the beam only cut small holes in the darkness. I felt exposed. My mind raced through the possibilities. Wild animals, hunters, someone else camping nearby. None of them fit perfectly, and the unknown made the fear worse. I got out of my sleeping bag and picked up the hatchet, holding it tightly in front of me. I moved slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, trying to see or hear anything. The sound had stopped, but my imagination filled in the gaps. I convinced myself it was nothing, that I was safe. I returned to the tent and tried to sleep, but the forest had changed. Every small sound, the wind rustling leaves, branches breaking, the flow of the river, felt amplified, threatening. I had been planning this trip for months. I wanted to be alone in the wilderness, away from the city, the noise, the constant pressure of work and people. I had read about this particular camping spot tucked deep in the forest of the Northern Highlands. It wasn't a famous site, not on any tourist maps, but some online hikers had posted about it, and their photographs showed a river cutting through dense pine trees, wide clearings, and an old gravel path leading in and out. I told myself that this would be the perfect place to disconnect, to escape everything. I didn't realize how dangerous my desire for solitude could become. I packed my car with everything I thought I might need. A large backpack with enough food for 5 days, water bottles, a portable stove, cooking utensils, a sleeping bag, a heavy-duty tent, and a first aid kit. I even packed extra blankets, just in case it got cold at night. I loaded in a small hatchet, a flashlight with extra batteries, a map of the area, a compass, and a pocket knife. I felt prepared, almost over-prepared. My car had a full tank, and I double-checked the route, marking the entry point and the rough path I would take through the forest. I left my itinerary with a friend, giving them approximate times for check-ins, though I didn't plan to use my phone much. I wanted no distractions, no interruptions. I left the city at sunrise. The road climbed steadily into the hills, winding past fields and then forests that grew thicker and darker as I ascended. Birds called in the morning air, and the wind carried a crisp chill that hinted at the winter to come. I had driven for hours, and when the road finally ended at a small gravel pull-off, I parked, took a deep breath, and unloaded my pack. The gravel crunched under my boots as I shouldered it and began walking toward the forest. At first, the forest felt welcoming. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappled the forest floor, and made the shadows dance. I followed a narrow path that rose gently, littered with pine needles and fallen leaves. The air smelled of damp earth and resin. I walked slowly, listening to the soft rustle of wind in the trees, the distant sound of birds, and my own boots pressing into the soft forest floor. Every so often, I stopped to admire the view through gaps in the trees. Small waterfalls feeding into the river below, moss-covered rocks, and the bright, clear sky above. By mid-afternoon, I had hiked nearly 2 miles and found a clearing beside the river. It was perfect, a wide, flat area, shielded by tall pines on 3 sides, with the river flowing quietly nearby. I set up my tent, arranging the sleeping bag inside and laying down my gear. Then I collected firewood, carefully choosing dry branches from under fallen trees, arranging them in a neat pile near the clearing. By the time I had a small fire going, the sun was already beginning to drop toward the horizon. I ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread while watching the river shimmer in the fading light. The forest was starting to quiet as the day came to an end. Birds had gone silent, insects hummed faintly, and even the river seemed to slow in sound as the shadows lengthened. I felt a calm sense of accomplishment, sitting by the fire with the warmth against the cold air. I extinguished my stove, put away the food, and crawled into my sleeping bag as darkness fell. First, the night was peaceful. The stars emerged one by one, and the forest seemed to settle into its own rhythm. I had the flashlight on my side, the knife within reach, and a sense that I was exactly where I needed to be. But then I noticed it. A faint noise, almost imperceptible at first, like the crackle of twigs under heavy boots. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal, deer, maybe a fox. But a shiver ran down my spine as I realized the noise had come from outside the clearing, somewhere deeper in the trees. The night stretched on, and I tried to ignore it. I drifted in and out of sleep, my ears straining for every sound. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. A crunch, followed by another, moving closer. My heart began to race. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in all directions, but the trees were dense, and the beam only cut small holes in the darkness. I felt exposed. My mind raced through the possibilities. Wild animals, hunters, someone else camping nearby. None of them fit perfectly, and the unknown made the fear worse. I got out of my sleeping bag and picked up the hatchet, holding it tightly in front of me. I moved slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, trying to see or hear anything. The sound had stopped, but my imagination filled in the gaps. I convinced myself it was nothing, that I was safe. I returned to the tent and tried to sleep, but the forest had changed. Every small sound, the wind rustling leaves, branches breaking, the flow of the river, felt amplified, threatening. Around midnight, a new sound emerged. It was soft at first, almost like breathing, but not human. I froze, my ears straining. Came again, closer, moving slowly, deliberately. My flashlight swept the edge of the clearing, and I caught a glimpse of movement. Something large, moving on all fours, slipping between the trees. I couldn't see clearly, but the shape was humanoid enough to make my stomach twist in fear. I remembered reading stories about desperate people or dangerous individuals in remote areas, but I had never considered the possibility of encountering one. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just held my breath and waited, listening. Hours passed, though it felt like days. Every sound, every shadow seemed to stretch time, making the night infinite. I stayed awake, holding the hatchet, my eyes scanning constantly, and my ears alert for the slightest noise. The forest was alive with sounds, some normal, some not. At one point, I thought I saw footprints in the soft soil near the river, too large and deep to be an animal, but I wasn't sure. The thought that someone could be watching me, following me, hiding in the darkness, kept me tense and frozen. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The world shifted from black to gray to gold. I quickly packed my camp, extinguishing the fire and checking my belongings. Everything was exactly where I had left it, but the footprints were still there, fading into the forest. I couldn't tell if they were human or not. I didn't stop to look. I started hiking back down the trail, my steps quick, my heart still racing. The hike back was tense but uneventful. Every rustle, every movement in the corner of my eye made me jump, but the sunlight and familiar path gradually eased my fear. By mid-morning, I reached the car, unlocked it, and slid inside. The engine roared to life, and I drove away without looking back. Even as I put distance between myself and the forest, my mind replayed the sounds of the night, the feeling of being watched, the unknown presence moving just beyond the firelight. Once I returned to town, I called my friend and recounted everything. I didn't tell them all the details. Some things are better left unsaid. But I made sure they understood the seriousness. The trip had been terrifying, but it also taught me something important. Preparation matters, awareness matters, and solitude in nature is a privilege that must be respected. I had been lucky. Whatever had been in the forest that night had left me unharmed, and I was alive. I never returned to that spot. I read reports of other hikers going missing in the same region, though none of them were close to my route. I realized that even in well-documented forests, even places that seem empty, there are unknown dangers, whether from wildlife or other humans. I learned to respect that danger, to plan better, to never assume safety simply because a map or a website says so. In the months after, I made smaller trips closer to town, practicing my camping skills and wilderness survival. I kept my emergency kit ready, always let someone know where I was, and never camped alone in a remote area again. The fear I experienced that night never left me entirely, but it became a reminder rather than a terror. A reminder that nature is beautiful but also unpredictable, and that human judgment, preparation, and respect for the wild are the most important tools we have to survive it. The trip stayed with me, in vivid detail. The way the forest looked in the fading light, the sound of the river, the shadowy shapes among the trees, the unshakable feeling of being watched. I still think about it, sometimes late at night, feeling that chill run down my spine as I remember how close I came to being lost, how small and vulnerable I was in that vast, indifferent wilderness. But I also remember the moment I reached the car, the sense of relief and safety, the knowledge that I had endured it and learned from it. That night taught me more about myself and the world than months of comfortable, safe living ever could. Nature is not a storybook. It does not reward carelessness. It does not notice us unless we make a mistake. I had been careless in assuming complete safety, but I survived, and I carried that survival as both a lesson and a warning. Now, when I hike or camp, I do so with humility, awareness, and respect. The fear is still there, but so is the knowledge that I am capable of navigating the unknown and returning home alive. And that, ultimately, is what made the experience real, terrifying, and unforgettable. I had been planning this camping trip for months, carefully studying maps, checking weather reports, and gathering all the gear I thought I would need. I wanted solitude, a chance to be alone in the forest for a few days, away from the constant noise and responsibilities of everyday life. I had chosen a remote area in the mountains, one of those places that barely anyone went to, where the forest was thick and the trails were barely more than animal paths. I wanted quiet. I wanted nature. I thought I was prepared. I was wrong. The drive up to the trailhead was long, twisting through narrow roads that clung to the sides of steep hills. I remember gripping the steering wheel tightly, feeling the weight of the car leaning into each turn. The forest on either side was dense, tall pines standing so close together that they blocked almost all sunlight. The air smelled of wet earth and resin, a sharp, clean scent that immediately reminded me I was far from the city. I parked the car at a small, barely visible lot at the end of the road, loaded my backpack and double-checked my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, stove, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, knife, rope. Everything was there. I thought I had thought of everything. I hadn't. The trail started as a narrow dirt path, soft with fallen pine needles, winding between thick trunks and underbrush. Birds called occasionally, a woodpecker tapping somewhere high above, the wind rustling the leaves, a squirrel scurrying across the ground. I felt a small thrill of excitement as I began walking. The air was cool and damp, and I could feel my heartbeat in my chest as I breathed deeply, drinking in the scent of the forest. The further I went, the quieter it got. There were no cars, no voices, no sounds of human activity at all. Just me, the trees, and the occasional animal. After a few hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing by a stream. The sunlight broke through the canopy here, casting long, dappled shadows across the mossy ground. I decided this would be my first night's campsite. I set down my pack and started unpacking. I pitched the tent first, choosing a spot that was flat, with a slight slope away from the stream so water wouldn't collect if it rained. The process was familiar. I had done this many times before, but I was careful. I wanted everything secure. I gathered some firewood, dry branches mostly, stacked them neatly, and arranged stones around them to make a fire pit. I checked my stove and set up a small cooking area. By the time I was finished, the sun was low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the forest. I had dinner quickly. Canned beans, a little jerky, and some granola. Nothing fancy, but it would keep me fed. As I ate, I listened to the forest around me. The stream babbled gently nearby, insects buzzed quietly, and a distant bird called somewhere unseen. The sounds were soothing, almost hypnotic. I cleaned up my dishes, made sure the firewood was stacked close but safe, and crawled into my tent. The air was already cold, and I zipped up tightly. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the hike. When I woke the next morning, the forest was alive with sound. Birds, insects, and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush filled the air. The sun was higher now, bright and warm, casting golden light through the trees. I packed up my campsite and continued hiking. My plan was to reach a more secluded spot deeper in the forest where I could camp for a few more nights. The trail was rougher now, less defined, and I had to step carefully over roots, rocks, and fallen branches. I kept checking my map and compass frequently. I thought I was following the trail correctly, but something was off. The landmarks didn't match exactly what I expected. I told myself I was just being cautious, that I would find the next clearing soon enough. By late afternoon, I realized I had been walking longer than I anticipated. My legs were sore, my pack heavy, and I hadn't seen any clearings or signs of human activity in hours. The trail had disappeared in places, overgrown with ferns and low shrubs. I stopped to rest, sitting on a moss-covered log, drinking water and trying to get my bearings. I checked my map again, and for the first time I noticed something worrying. The path I had been following didn't seem to exist where I was. I must have taken a wrong turn at some point. Panic began to creep in. I wasn't lost, not exactly, but I was off course, and the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky. I needed to find a safe place to camp before dark. I continued walking, eyes scanning the forest for any sign of a suitable clearing. The underbrush grew thicker, and I had to push branches aside as I moved. I stumbled a few times, scraping my hands on bark, twisting my ankle slightly, but nothing serious. Finally, I found a small patch of flat ground near a bend in the stream. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. I set up my tent quickly, more out of necessity than care. I gathered what little firewood I could find nearby, realizing that the supply was sparse here. The stream provided water, at least. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I had faced rough trails before. I could handle this. As darkness fell, the forest changed. The familiar sounds of the day faded, replaced by a low, constant rustling and the occasional snapping of twigs. My imagination ran wild at first, but I reminded myself that it was just animals moving around, probably deer or raccoons. I cooked a small meal, ate quickly, and then sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The shadows of the trees danced in the firelight, tall and strange. I could feel the tension building in my body. Every crack of a branch, every distant sound made me flinch. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that fear made the forest seem larger and darker than it really was. I went to bed early that night, but sleep did not come easily. Every little noise startled me. The wind rustled through the trees, a branch broke somewhere off in the distance, and I imagined shadows moving just beyond the tent. I told myself to breathe slowly, to relax, but the tension stayed. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing, or what I thought was heavy breathing, just outside the tent. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, listening, straining to hear over my own heartbeat. Then a branch snapped closer, very close. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside. Nothing, just the trees, the underbrush, and the faint reflection of the stream. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a bear. I had bear spray and my knife was close. I forced myself to settle down and eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. My muscles ached, my back was sore, and I felt drained. I packed up quickly, wanting to get back on a more secure trail. As I moved through the forest, I realized I had no clear sense of direction. The map wasn't helping much because I had veered off course the previous day, and there were no obvious landmarks. I tried to use the stream as a guide, following it in the hope it would lead to a larger river or a trail. Hours passed, and the forest seemed endless. My pace slowed as fatigue set in. I drank water sparingly, ate small amounts of granola, trying to conserve energy. By midday, I realized something alarming. The forest was eerily quiet. The usual rustling, chirping, and movement of animals had stopped. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. My heart raced. I walked faster, trying to find any sign of human presence, any trail, any sound of a road, anything. The sun was high but filtered through the dense canopy, making the forest dim and shadowed. My sense of time warped. I kept walking, but every direction looked the same. Tall, straight pines, undergrowth, moss-covered rocks, and fallen branches. I began to doubt whether I could find my way out. The thought of spending another night here alone filled me with dread. Not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of the very real danger of getting lost, of injury, of running out of food or water. As the afternoon wore on, I found a small ridge. I climbed it, hoping to get a better view. From the top, I could see only more trees stretching endlessly in every direction. There was no clearing, no hint of a trail, No sign of any human presence. Panic began to set in fully. I stopped, sat on a rock, and tried to think rationally. I had water, I had some food, I had my gear. I could survive for a few days if necessary, but I needed a plan. I remembered the advice I had read about staying put if lost in the woods, using a high point to signal for help, making yourself visible, keeping calm. I resolved to follow the stream downstream, reasoning that it might eventually lead to a road or larger waterway where people could be found. The forest grew denser as I descended. Branches scraped my arms and face. Roots threatened to trip me, and my legs ached more with every step. I stumbled a few times, scraping my knees and hands, my backpack catching on branches. At one point, I slipped on wet moss and fell heavily, my elbow cutting into a sharp rock. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to keep moving, telling myself that stopping was not an option. As evening approached, I found another small clearing near the stream. It was just large enough to pitch my tent, but I was exhausted. I set it up quickly, gathered whatever firewood I could find, and tried to get a fire going. Smoke and sparks flared, but I managed to coax a small flame. I sat near it, eating some jerky and drinking water, feeling the cold settle in as the sun disappeared. The forest seemed darker than ever. Every noise made me jump. My mind imagined things moving just out of sight. I forced myself to focus on practical things. Fire, food, water, sleep. Nothing more. That night I slept fitfully. I woke repeatedly to the sounds of the forest, convinced I heard something moving near my tent. I stayed alert, listening, straining my ears. I was tired, but I couldn't let myself completely relax. I realized how small and vulnerable I was in this vast wilderness. The wind rustled through the trees, the stream gurgled quietly, and a distant sound, a long, low groan, made me freeze. My imagination tried to explain it, telling me it was just a tree branch, just an animal, just the wind. I forced myself to lie still and eventually fell into shallow, interrupted sleep. The next morning, I awoke to rain. Light at first, then heavier, drenching the forest. My tent was soaked, the ground muddy. I packed my things as best I could, tying everything tightly in waterproof bags. But the rain made everything heavier. My boots were wet, my clothes damp, and the trail, or lack of one, was now slippery and treacherous. I had to be careful with every step, watching for roots, mud, and hidden rocks. I kept following the stream, hoping it would lead me somewhere. Hours passed, the rain relentless, turning the forest into a slick, slippery maze. My muscles ached. My hands were raw from gripping wet branches and rocks, and my energy was low. I ate a little, drank a little, and kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached a point where the stream widened and deepened. It was impassable on foot. I was forced to stop, exhausted and frustrated. I set up a makeshift camp near the water's edge, just a small spot where I could stay dry under a fallen tree. I ate the last of my food, drank water sparingly, and sat shivering. I felt completely alone, exposed, and small. I realized I had been lost for almost 2 full days. My legs were stiff, my feet blistered, and my hands raw. The forest was relentless, unchanging, and vast. I knew I needed to conserve energy, stay dry, and be patient. Panic would not help me. I reminded myself to stay calm, focus on survival, and think rationally. During the night, the rain continued, but I was protected under my small shelter. I kept a small fire going, feeding it carefully with wet branches, coaxing flames out of damp wood. I stayed awake much of the night, listening, watching, alert. I knew that being careless in this environment could be deadly. If I fell, injured myself further, or lost the fire, I could be in serious danger. I slept in short bursts, waking frequently to tend the fire and check the area. Each sound made me tense, but I forced myself to remember it was just the forest, just animals, just the wind and rain. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The forest was wet, dripping, and the stream was higher and faster. I knew I had to keep moving. I followed the stream carefully, looking for any sign of human activity, any trail, any road. Hours passed with nothing. My legs screamed with exhaustion, my back ached, and my energy was low. I ate small amounts, drank water, and pushed on. Eventually, I reached a point where the stream split. One branch went into a dense thicket. The other seemed to descend toward a flatter area. I chose the flatter path, reasoning that it might eventually lead to human habitation. I kept moving, step by step, careful, alert, conserving energy where I could. By late afternoon, I saw it. A faint glimmer of something unnatural through the trees. A stretch of gravel or dirt that didn't belong in the forest. My heart leapt. I approached carefully, and as I broke through the underbrush, I found an old, seldom used logging road. It was overgrown in places, but it was a road, and that meant it would eventually lead to somewhere. I followed it, slow but steady, the relief building with every step. My legs burned, my feet ached, but I kept going. As the sun began to dip low, I finally heard a faint sound in the distance. The hum of a vehicle. My pace quickened. I broke through the last line of trees and saw a small road, and on it, a truck coming toward me. I waved frantically, shouting, though my voice was hoarse from 2 days of shouting nothing. The driver stopped, a man in his truck looking concerned. I ran toward him, exhausted, grateful, relieved. I had made it. I was safe. He gave me a ride to the nearest town, where I could finally get food, warmth, and help. I called my family, told them I was okay, though every detail of the last 2 days was etched in my memory. I had been lost, scared, and alone, but I had survived by staying calm, careful, and determined. The forest had tested me, pushed me to my limits, and I had made it through. I realized that nature was beautiful but indifferent, powerful but unforgiving. I was alive, and that was enough. I had a story of survival, a deep respect for the wilderness, and a reminder that even in the darkest, most frightening moments, careful thinking, patience, and persistence could see me through. I never camped alone in such a remote place again, but I carried the lessons with me forever. The smell of wet pine, the sound of rushing water, the cold, damp night, and the feeling of absolute isolation, and the memory of relief that comes when, after everything, you finally find your way back to safety. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. The idea of escaping the constant hum of city life, the traffic, the screens, and the people had consumed me. I wanted silence, I wanted isolation, and I wanted to push myself into a wilderness I had never explored before. I chose a remote section of a national forest, miles away from the nearest road or ranger station, a place where cell signals were a memory and the world as I knew it seemed to end at the treeline. I set out early in the morning, driving my old, rattling truck as far as the dirt road would allow before leaving it behind. I hoisted my backpack, heavy with food, water, a tent, sleeping bag, a first aid kit, and a basic set of survival tools. The air smelled of wet pine and soil, sharp and clean, a smell I had missed more than I realized. My plan was simple. Hike deep into the forest, find a spot near a river or stream, set up camp, and spend the next 4 days completely alone. The first hours were calm and almost meditative. Sunlight broke through the canopy in scattered, golden streams. Birds flitted between branches, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. I felt energized and alive, the kind of alive that comes only from total immersion in nature. I walked steadily, following a small map I had drawn from satellite images and topographical charts, and marking small trail points with colored tape I had brought. By mid-afternoon, I had found a clearing that seemed perfect. A small stream ran nearby, bordered by smooth rocks and patches of moss. The trees thinned enough that sunlight fell on the ground in soft patches, warming the damp earth. I dropped my pack, feeling the weight leave my shoulders, and began setting up my tent. I chose a flat section, free from rocks and roots, close enough to hear the stream but far enough to avoid flooding if the water rose overnight. I drove the stakes into the soft soil, rolled out my sleeping bag, and arranged my camping stove and supplies neatly to the side. The day stretched lazily. I explored the surrounding area, noting landmarks in case I needed to find my way back in low light. The air was growing cooler, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the distant ridges. I started a small fire, cooking a simple meal of rice, beans, and canned meat, the smell of it filling the air. Eating alone had a strange intensity. Each bite seemed louder in the quiet. As darkness crept across the forest, the sounds of the wilderness grew louder. The chirp of insects, the splash of water over stones, the distant call of an owl. That night I slept fitfully. The forest felt alive in a way I wasn't used to. Branches creaked under the wind, and every snapping twig made my heart skip. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something moving near the stream. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was deliberate, heavier than a small animal, rustling leaves and snapping small branches. I stayed still, listening, holding my breath. The noise moved in short bursts, sometimes closer, sometimes further, always just outside my line of sight. My stomach tightened. I had told myself that being alone was part of the experience, but now the reality of isolation was pressing down. By the time morning came, the unease hadn't left me. The forest looked peaceful in the sunlight, almost deceptive. I ate quickly, packed my stove, and decided to hike further along the stream, hoping that distance would ease my nerves. I passed fallen trees, thick undergrowth, and slippery rocks. The stream became narrower, more jagged, winding through deeper parts of the forest. The sense of remoteness intensified. By mid-morning, I reached a small waterfall, a beautiful cascade over dark rocks. I paused to rest, filling my water bottle from the clean, cold water. That's when I noticed it. Footprints in the mud, large, human-like, leading upstream. I froze. They weren't mine, and there hadn't been anyone else when I started the hike. The prints were fresh, and they followed the edge of the stream in the direction I intended to go. My mind raced. I wasn't in a heavily trafficked area. These prints couldn't be casual hikers. I debated turning back, but curiosity, combined with my pride, kept me moving. I followed the prints cautiously, scanning the trees and undergrowth for any sign of movement. The day became oppressive. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, felt amplified. Shadows under trees seemed to move with intent. I kept my knife accessible and my walking stick in front of me, every step deliberate and careful. By late afternoon, I came across an old campsite, long abandoned. A rusted can, a tattered tarp, and a few broken sticks marked where someone had been. The site looked like it had been deserted years ago, but the footprints suggested otherwise. Whoever had passed here had hidden from sight, leaving no evidence of their presence other than the prints themselves. I decided to set up my camp again, this time further from the stream and near a ridge that overlooked the area. I cleared a small flat space, packed the tent tightly, and ensured my firewood was nearby but out of easy sight. The night fell quickly. I stayed awake longer than I had the first night, listening intently. The forest had a rhythm. Sometimes the wind, sometimes the water, sometimes the small nocturnal creatures. But tonight there was an added tension. Something else was moving, something deliberate. I never saw it, never heard it come close, but I felt its presence in the subtle disturbances. A broken twig, a rustle that ended too abruptly, footprints in soft soil that hadn't been there earlier. By the third day, I had grown hyper-aware of every detail. The forest that had once felt beautiful and liberating now felt oppressive and untrustworthy. I started marking my route more carefully, tying strips of cloth to branches to track where I had been. My food supply was dwindling, and I knew I needed to either hike out or find more provisions. But the path back now felt dangerous, and the isolation pressed down on me like a physical weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been following me. Every time I stopped to rest, I felt observed, measured. Late that afternoon, I stumbled upon a small clearing where an old cabin stood, partially collapsed. The structure looked abandoned for decades. I approached cautiously, checking for signs of recent occupation. Nothing obvious, just broken wood, a collapsed roof, and a heavy layer of leaves on the ground. But inside, I found something unexpected. Fresh footprints leading out to the ridge. Someone had been here recently. My anxiety spiked. I had no idea whether the person was dangerous, friendly, or simply another camper. But the unknown was worse than any known threat. I spent hours watching from the trees, waiting for movement. Nothing came. That night, I made a conscious decision. I would leave before dawn. I packed lightly, taking only the essentials: water, food for the journey, and my knife. I had learned the forest's rhythm, remembered the landmarks, and memorized the route back to the dirt road. The air was cold and damp as I moved, each step calculated to avoid snapping twigs or disturbing leaves unnecessarily. My heart pounded, not just from the exertion, but from fear. I felt the presence behind me in the shadows, subtle but constant, always at the edge of perception. Hours passed. I moved steadily, avoiding the stream and the old cabin, taking detours to prevent leaving a direct trail. By late morning, I reached a small rise where I could see the dirt road in the distance. Relief surged through me. My pace quickened. Every muscle ached. My body pushed beyond comfort, but adrenaline kept me moving. As I crested the final ridge, I saw my truck, still where I had left it, dusted lightly with morning frost. I approached slowly, scanning the surrounding treeline. Nothing moved. The forest seemed inert, almost passive, but the tension from the past days lingered in my muscles and nerves. I loaded my gear quickly, started the truck, and drove off the dirt road toward civilization. Each mile away from the forest felt lighter, freer, but the intensity of what I had experienced stayed with me. I realized that the forest, beautiful and raw, had a way of testing every sense, every instinct. And while I had left unscathed, the awareness of another presence, deliberate and hidden, had made the wilderness feel far more dangerous than I had imagined. By the time I reached the main highway, the sun was setting. I stopped at a gas station to refuel and grab something to eat. I sat in the truck for a long time, staring at the forest in the distance, reflecting on the isolation, the fear, and the clarity that came with surviving something that tested not just physical endurance, but mental awareness. I had set out seeking peace and solitude, and I had found both in ways I had never expected. I realized that nature demanded respect, attention, and humility, and that even in the absence of humans, stories, or legends, it could be terrifyingly alive and unpredictable. The next days, I rested, recovered, and shared my experience in journals and notes. I recorded every detail: the path I took, the signs of life, the subtle warnings, the markers of other humans, and the methods I used to navigate and survive. I didn't tell anyone about the footprints following me, about the feeling of being watched, because I didn't want to diminish the clarity and beauty I had found in the challenge. I had left the forest physically unhurt, and I had returned wiser and more attuned to the rawness of the world beyond human settlements. That experience stayed with me, shaping every hike, every journey, and every time I sought solitude. I knew that respect for nature was not just an ideal, but a necessity, and that fear, when balanced with preparation and observation, could be transformed into clarity and survival. The forest remained behind me, silent and indifferent. I carried its lessons with me: the weight of isolation, the sharpness of awareness, and the quiet, persistent reminder that the wilderness, in its purest form, demanded everything from those who entered. And in that clarity, in that understanding of limits and survival, I found a strange sense of peace that city life had never given me. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted a break from the city, from the constant noise and lights, and I wanted to be alone with nature for a while. I packed my old, slightly worn backpack with all the essentials I thought I would need: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, food, water, a first aid kit, and a small, sharp knife. I had checked the weather reports multiple times, packed extra layers of clothes, and mapped out a route that led deep into the forest, far from any roads or trails I knew. I had wanted this trip to be an adventure, a test of my independence, but I also wanted it to be safe. I believed I had prepared well. I arrived at the trailhead in the early morning. The sky was pale gray, the sun just rising and casting long shadows through the trees. I could smell damp earth and pine, and the cold air made my lungs feel sharp and clean. The forest ahead looked quiet and inviting, almost too quiet. I checked my pack one last time, slung it over my shoulders, and started down the narrow path, feeling the weight of the bag pressing against my back. The first few hours were easy. The trail was not steep, and the ground was firm, covered with fallen pine needles. Birds called occasionally, but there was no other sound, no wind in the trees, nothing that hinted at danger. I felt completely alone, but in a good way. I enjoyed the quiet. By late morning, I reached a small clearing by a stream. I stopped for a break, crouching by the water to drink and refill my bottle. The water was cold and refreshing. I leaned back against a tree, feeling the sun on my face, and I watched a squirrel dart up the trunk of a nearby tree. At that moment, everything felt perfect. I had the forest all to myself. I thought about how lucky I was to be able to get away from people, from the city, from my own worries. I had no idea how quickly that feeling would change. I continued walking along the trail, following the stream. The sun was higher now, and the forest seemed brighter, more alive. But as I moved deeper, the trail became less defined. Roots twisted across it, and the ground was damp and muddy. My boots sank into the soft earth. I could hear the sound of water moving over rocks, a soothing rhythm, but it also reminded me that I was far from anything familiar. I felt a small flicker of anxiety but dismissed it. I was experienced in camping, I told myself. I had done this before. I was prepared. I ignored the feeling, focusing on the path ahead. By mid-afternoon, I found a place that looked suitable for setting up camp. It was a flat area surrounded by tall trees, and there was a small, dry patch of ground where I could pitch my tent. I unpacked my gear, careful to organize everything. I pitched the tent, secured it with stakes, and laid out my sleeping bag inside. I gathered some dry wood and small twigs to make a fire later. The forest around me was dense, and the sunlight barely reached the ground through the thick canopy. The shadows seemed longer here, darker, and I realized I could not see very far in any direction. I tried not to let it bother me. This was normal. The forest was thick. It was supposed to feel isolated. As evening approached, I started my fire. I had brought matches and a small fire starter, and I worked carefully, arranging twigs and small branches until the fire caught. The flames crackled and gave off heat and light, and I sat close, feeling the warmth on my face. I cooked a small meal, beans and rice from a can, and ate slowly. I listened to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the movement of small animals in the underbrush. I felt safe, more or less. The sun was setting, and the sky was turning orange and purple through the gaps in the trees. I watched until it was dark, then crawled into my sleeping bag, zipping the tent closed. I lay there listening to the night. Crickets chirped, owls called in the distance, and every once in a while, the snap of a twig echoed nearby. I tried not to think about it. It was natural. Animals moved at night. Nothing to worry about. Around midnight, I woke to a sound outside the tent. First, I thought it was the wind. My tent flapped slightly, and I heard the soft, crunching steps of something moving over dry leaves. My heart rate quickened. I stayed still, listening. The sound moved closer, circling the tent. I strained to see through the thin tent fabric, but it was too dark. The fire had burned out, leaving only a faint glow from embers. I gripped my knife and waited. The steps stopped for a moment, then started again. They were heavy, deliberate, and unlike any animal I had heard. I realized then that someone, or something, was walking near my camp. I tried to tell myself it was another camper, but I had seen no one all day, and the nearest trailhead was miles away. I felt a deep, cold panic. My body froze and my mind raced. I stayed in the tent, holding my knife, listening. The movement continued around the perimeter, slow and careful, stopping occasionally as if someone was watching. My imagination tried to take over, telling me every possible horror, every risk I had never considered. but I knew I had to stay calm. I could not run blindly into the forest. I waited until the sound faded into the distance. Hours passed, and I could hear nothing. I tried to sleep, but every small sound made me tense. When the first light of dawn came, I unzipped the tent and looked around. The forest was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But I noticed footprints in the mud, large and booted, circling near my camp. My heart sank. Someone had been there, close enough to reach me, and I had not seen them until it was too late. I knew I had to move. I packed everything quickly, leaving the campsite exactly as it was. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead to a more familiar trail or at least a road. Every sound made me jump. Every branch snapping under my boots felt like it was following me. I stayed alert, constantly scanning my surroundings. Hours passed. My legs ached. My backpack felt heavier with every step, and my throat was dry. I tried to ration the water, taking small sips. I forced myself to keep going, even as exhaustion set in. I kept imagining someone following me, just beyond the trees, keeping pace. I could not know if they were real, but I could not take the risk. I kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I found a ridge overlooking a larger valley. From there, I could see a faint dirt road winding through the trees in the distance. Relief washed over me. I still had a long way to go, but I now had a destination. I carefully made my way down the steep slope, using my hands to stabilize myself, and avoided the loose rocks that threatened to send me sliding. My boots were muddy, my hands scratched and bleeding from branches, but I kept moving, step by step. Every sound made me tense, every shadow seemed to shift, but I focused on the road ahead. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the dirt road. It was quiet, empty, and sunlit. I walked along it, waving my arms, hoping someone would see me. Eventually, I saw a car coming from the distance. Relief flooded through me. I waved and ran toward it, my legs shaking. The car slowed and stopped. I told the driver where I had come from and how I had been camping alone, and they agreed to give me a ride back to the nearest town. I felt safe again, but my body still shook with tension, my mind replaying the night over and over. Back in town, I bought water, food, and a phone charger. I sat in a small diner, finally able to eat a proper meal, feeling the normal warmth of other people around me. I realized how lucky I had been to get away safely. I had underestimated the risks of being alone in a remote forest, and the night had taught me how careful I needed to be. I made a mental note that I would not go so deep into unknown wilderness alone again. I had survived, but I would never forget the fear, the feeling of someone or something moving unseen just beyond my reach. I had been planning the trip for weeks, the sort of trip that promised solitude and quiet, a place far away from the noise of the city and the constant pull of screens and people. I packed my gear carefully, folding my clothes and making sure every item in my backpack had its place. I had my tent, a small but sturdy one I had bought for emergencies, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a portable stove, a small collection of canned food, a first aid kit, and plenty of water. I wanted to be completely self-reliant. My plan was simple. Drive a few hours to a national forest I had been researching, find a spot deep enough to be isolated but still accessible, and camp alone for a few nights. The drive itself was uneventful. As I moved further away from the city, the traffic thinned out and the noise faded into the background. The sky was a clear blue, the kind of blue that makes you feel lighter just by looking at it, and the trees became taller, older, as if they had been waiting for someone to come see them. I took a turn onto a gravel road I had found on a map, and from that point on, the world seemed to shrink. The road twisted and curved through dense forest, the sunlight breaking through the branches in sharp, scattered rays. I noticed the smell first, the damp, rich scent of the earth, mixed with the subtle tang of pine and moss. There was a serenity to it, and I felt a growing sense of excitement. This was exactly what I had been craving, the kind of silence that can only exist when civilization is miles away. After what felt like hours, I found a clearing near a small stream. The water was shallow and clear, tumbling over smooth rocks in a quiet, constant rhythm. It seemed perfect. I parked my car on the edge of the clearing, away from the water but close enough that I could hear it. I unloaded my gear carefully, laying out the tent, checking the straps, and making sure the ground was level. The forest was dense on all sides, trees standing shoulder to shoulder, their trunks thick and rough. I set up camp in the middle of the clearing, giving myself a wide perimeter so I could see anyone, or anything, approaching from any direction. Once the tent was up, I took some time to explore the immediate area. The stream curved gently through the forest, and I followed it for a short distance. I noticed animal tracks in the soft mud. Deer, raccoons, something smaller I couldn't immediately identify. Birds flitted through the branches above, their calls sharp and clear. The air smelled fresher here than anywhere I had been in the city, carrying with it the faint aroma of wet leaves and damp soil. I felt alive in a way I rarely did in my daily life. As night approached, I returned to the clearing. I set up a small fire pit using stones I found nearby to create a ring. I gathered kindling and small pieces of wood, arranging them carefully. Lighting a fire in the wilderness had a ritualistic feel. The initial spark, the sudden smoke, the crackling that followed as the flame caught. I sat by the fire for hours, watching the flames dance and listening to the forest settle into night. The stream gurgled softly beside me, and the wind whispered through the trees. That was when I first noticed the sounds that didn't belong. At first, they were faint, barely distinguishable from the normal night noises of a forest. A snap of a branch here, a rustle there, something moving just beyond my line of sight. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that animals were simply moving through the underbrush. But as the night went on, the sounds grew closer, more deliberate. It was the rhythm of footsteps, not hurried, but slow and heavy, pacing just beyond the firelight. I tried to focus on the fire, to concentrate on the warmth and the comforting crackle of the flames. But my eyes kept darting to the shadows beyond the ring of light, where the trees stood like silent sentinels. I couldn't see anything at first, just the dark shapes of trunks and leaves. Then, I noticed movement, slight but unmistakable. A figure, crouched low, moving carefully through the trees. My heart rate picked up, and I instinctively reached for the small folding knife I had brought for emergencies. The figure stayed at the edge of the light, never fully stepping into it, as if testing me, measuring my reaction. I realized then that it wasn't an animal. Nothing I had ever seen moved like that, silent, deliberate, human-like. I froze, trying to convince myself it was a trick of my mind, a shadow shaped by the flickering flames. But the footsteps continued, circling my camp in a slow, methodical pattern. Each step was deliberate, heavy in a way that suggested intent. I remembered the car. It was close, and if necessary, I could make a run for it. But my instincts told me that any sudden movement could provoke whoever or whatever was out there. I stayed low, keeping the fire between me and the dark shapes of the forest. My mind raced, thinking through scenarios, imagining what this person might want, how I could escape if necessary. I realized then how unprepared I was for an actual encounter with another human out here. I had assumed I would be alone, safe, and undisturbed. The reality was far different. Hours seemed to pass like minutes, each movement in the shadows sending my heart into my throat. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, and I tried to calm myself, telling myself that if I remained still, they might leave. But the sounds didn't leave. They shifted, paused, then resumed, as if aware of my presence and waiting for something. The fire began to die down, the flames shrinking to embers, and the shadows deepened, merging into one dark wall that surrounded me. I added more wood, desperately trying to keep the light up, but each crackle and snap seemed to attract more attention. At one point, I saw it clearly. A man, tall and lean, moving through the trees with an unnatural quiet. He carried something long, a stick or perhaps a tool, but I couldn't make it out. His movements were precise, deliberate, and he never hesitated, never faltered. I realized then that he had been observing me for some time, waiting, learning my patterns, calculating. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain still. Any sudden motion could give me away. I spent the night like that, crouched by the fire, barely daring to breathe. The man never stepped fully into the light, never revealed himself completely, but he didn't leave either. As dawn approached, the forest lightened gradually, shadows retreating into the corners of the trees. I waited until the sun was high enough to illuminate the clearing before I dared to move. By then, the figure was gone, vanished into the underbrush without a trace. The relief I felt was immense, but it was tempered by a cold, creeping awareness. I wasn't safe. Not truly. The man could still be out there, watching, following, waiting for the next opportunity. I decided then that I had to leave immediately. I packed my tent, stuffed my belongings into the backpack, and kept my knife ready. Every rustle, every bird call, every snap of a branch made my heart leap. I kept my eyes on the perimeter constantly, moving carefully, methodically, as if any mistake could be my last. I reached the car without incident, though my hands shook as I unlocked the door and climbed inside. The engine roared to life, and the sound seemed deafening after the oppressive silence of the forest. I drove without stopping, without looking back, sticking to the gravel roads and avoiding any paths that led deeper into the forest. My mind replayed every movement, every sound from the night before, and I realized how easily things could have gone differently. I thought about how long I would have survived if he had made a sudden move, or if I had panicked. The reality of it weighed heavily on me. It took hours to reach a main road, the kind where other cars were frequent, and civilization began to feel safe again. I stopped at a small gas station, bought some food, and called a friend, though I didn't go into details. I needed to be somewhere where I could see people, hear voices, feel the ordinary hum of life around me. That night, in a motel room, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in my mind. I thought about the man, about how close I had come to a confrontation, and I realized that the forest was not a place of simple beauty. It could be dangerous, and being alone amplified that danger exponentially. In the days that followed, I returned to the forest only during the day, never camping, always with people. I researched similar incidents, read stories of hikers and campers encountering strangers in remote areas, and I understood that the wilderness held both serenity and peril. It demanded respect, preparation, and caution. I had been naive, and the near encounter was a lesson that would never leave me. Eventually, I did return to camping, but never alone. I learned to choose locations with other campers nearby, to keep my phone charged, to carry more than just a small knife, and to always let someone know exactly where I was going. I never saw the man again, and I don't know if he was a random trespasser, someone living in the forest illegally, or something more dangerous. But I remembered the fear, the tension, the sense of being watched in a place that should have been safe. And I remembered that night vividly. The sounds, the shadows, the careful calculations I made just to survive. That night changed how I approached the wilderness forever. Even now, when I prepare for a camping trip, I think back to that first experience. The forest is beautiful, yes, but it is unpredictable, and it has no sympathy for mistakes. And sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees in a certain way, I can almost hear those slow, deliberate footsteps, and I remember just how close I came to a danger I had never imagined. I had been planning this camping trip for weeks, mapping out every detail, making sure I had all the equipment I would need. I wanted something different this time. Not the crowded campgrounds with noisy families and bright lanterns, but a real wilderness experience, somewhere deep, far from people. The idea was simple. Hike into a remote section of the forest, spend 3 nights alone, and live off the essentials I carried. I wanted to test myself, my instincts, and my preparedness. I set out early in the morning, carrying a heavy backpack loaded with food, water, a tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, a small stove, and other survival gear. The trail started gently, winding through pine trees, the ground soft with layers of needles, and sunlight filtering through the branches. The air smelled fresh, with a faint, earthy tang from damp soil and moss. Birds chirped intermittently, and I could hear the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It felt peaceful, almost too calm, and I told myself that peace often carries its own danger. As I hiked deeper, the trail became less defined. Signs of human activity, discarded wrappers, faded markers, even faint footprints, faded completely. I was alone, except for the occasional squirrel or woodpecker. I crossed a small creek that bubbled over smooth stones, its water cold and clear. I drank carefully from it, using my filter. The sound of water, usually comforting, started to feel louder and more insistent as the day went on, like it was filling the silence around me. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a bend in the creek that looked ideal for setting up camp. The ground was flat, covered in soft pine needles, and surrounded by thick trees that offered some shelter from the wind. I pitched my tent meticulously, making sure the stakes were firm, and arranged a perimeter around the site using rocks and small branches. I had read enough survival manuals to know the importance of observing the surroundings, noticing signs of wildlife, and identifying potential hazards. After setting up, I explored a little, making mental notes of nearby landmarks. The creek, a large boulder that would be visible from any approach, a patch of thorny bushes on the east side. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. I prepared a small dinner on my portable stove, heating canned beans and rice, and ate slowly, listening to the forest around me. That night, the forest sounded different. The wind shifted, rustling leaves and making tree branches creak. I could hear distant animal calls that were unfamiliar, almost too close for comfort. I reminded myself it was all natural, normal in the wilderness, yet the sensation of being completely alone gnawed at the edges of my mind. I stayed alert, checking my flashlight, keeping my knife within reach, and scanning the tree line every time I heard a movement. Sleep came in fits, shallow and interrupted, with dreams that merged indistinctly with the noises outside. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, noticing an odd feeling. Something in the air had changed overnight. The creek, which had been clear and calm, now seemed slightly murky, and small bits of debris floated along the current. I decided to investigate downstream. I moved carefully, avoiding making unnecessary noise. As I followed the creek, I saw signs that made my heart rate spike. Deep claw marks on the bark of a tree, footprints in the mud that were larger than any human foot, and broken branches that indicated something heavy had moved through recently. I realized that whatever had passed by had not been a small animal. My mind went through the possibilities: bears, wildcats, maybe even a large pack of wolves. I had read that bears often travel through creek beds in search of food, especially in the early morning when water was plentiful. I checked my surroundings carefully, scanning the trees and the dense underbrush. There was no sound, but the feeling of being watched was almost tangible. Returning to my camp, I took precautionary measures I had studied in wilderness survival guides. I secured all food in a bear-proof container, hung it from a sturdy tree branch well away from the tent, and made sure all scented items, including soap and toothpaste, were inside. I avoided using scented lotions and kept my knife and a sturdy stick within reach. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me tense, and I found myself jumping at small noises that I would normally ignore. The fifth day was the hardest physically. I had set out early, hoping to make up distance and find a lower, safer campsite. The trail had nearly disappeared in some sections, forcing me to climb over fallen trees and navigate steep, loose rock. My legs ached, my back burned from the weight of my pack, and my water was dangerously low. By mid-morning, I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The terrain looked unfamiliar, and I couldn't locate the trail on my map. Panic started to creep in. I sat on a rock, trying to calm myself, checking the compass and scanning the landscape. The forest stretched endlessly, and I realized I had no idea exactly where I was. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything seemed disorienting. The trees all looked the same, the ridges and valleys blending together. I drank sparingly, knowing I didn't have enough water to keep going indefinitely. The sun was already low in the sky when I stumbled upon a small depression where the ground was flat. It wasn't ideal for camping, but I had no choice. I set up the tent quickly, securing it as best I could on the uneven ground. I boiled water from a small puddle, feeling nervous about drinking it, and ate a meager dinner. The wind had calmed slightly, but the forest felt heavier, almost oppressive. That night, the forest seemed alive in a way it hadn't before. Every sound was magnified. The crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl. I slept fitfully, waking repeatedly to listen, imagining threats that were probably nothing but the forest itself. When I woke before dawn, I realized the situation was worse than I thought. My water supply was critically low, my food had diminished, and I had no clear sense of direction. I tried to trace my route from memory, but the effort left me exhausted. I realized I was facing a situation where survival required careful thinking and discipline, not just endurance. The 6th day was a struggle. I rationed my remaining water carefully, taking only a few sips at a time. I marked my path as I moved, using sticks and rocks to leave small indicators, hoping they would guide me back if I needed to retrace my steps. The sun rose high, heating the ground and making my exertion even more draining. I climbed steep slopes slowly, pausing often to breathe, eat small bits of food, and drink water. I felt weak, my muscles trembling, my mind foggy from hunger and dehydration. The forest was beautiful, but beauty was no comfort when it pressed in so heavily on every side, reminding me how isolated I truly was. By mid-afternoon, I found a small stream, the first significant water I had seen in over a day. I treated it carefully and drank greedily, feeling my body respond immediately. I filled my bottles and rested, realizing that without this water, I might not have made it through the next day. I thought through my options. I couldn't stay in one place. I had to find the main trail or some sign of civilization, but I also had to avoid overexerting myself. I decided to follow the stream downhill, reasoning that water often leads to human activity. As I moved along the stream, the terrain grew steep and rocky. Slipping on wet rocks, I nearly fell more than once. I kept my pack tight to my body, using my hands to balance, each step deliberate and careful. Shadows stretched long in the late afternoon, and I felt a gnawing anxiety as I realized darkness would come before I could find a safe campsite. By the time I spotted a narrow ledge above the stream where I could set up a small, precarious tent, the light was fading fast. I secured the tent, but it was uncomfortable and unstable. I ate what little food I had left and went to sleep almost immediately, exhausted. The 7th day was the turning point. I woke early, feeling both dread and determination. I decided to continue following the stream, reasoning that it had to lead somewhere. Every step was physically taxing, but I was alert to every sound, every sign of danger. As the morning progressed, I heard a distant roar. My heart jumped. It was not human, but the sound of rushing water, a waterfall hidden by the trees. Relief and caution mingled. I climbed carefully toward the sound and eventually emerged at a steep drop where the stream plunged over a cliff, creating a roaring waterfall. From there, I could see a valley below with what looked like open fields and possibly buildings in the distance. I felt a surge of hope. The climb down was difficult, and I had to navigate loose rocks and steep soil, but I moved slowly and carefully. My hands were cut and scraped, my legs burned, but the thought of reaching safety kept me going. After hours of careful descent, I reached the base of the hill and finally spotted a dirt road. I followed it, shouting and waving when I saw a distant figure. Within an hour, I was greeted by hikers who had seen me coming and offered water, food, and a phone to call for help. They were astonished by my appearance. Tired, dirty, and scratched from my ordeal, but alive. I spent the night at a nearby ranger station, receiving medical attention for minor injuries, drinking water until I felt normal, and eating more than I had in days. I realized how close I had come to a potentially life-threatening situation. The experience had been terrifying and exhausting, but it also gave me a profound appreciation for preparation, caution, and respect for the wilderness. I returned home several days later, physically worn but mentally changed. I had survived not because of luck, but because I had remained calm, assessed my situation carefully, and made deliberate choices even when fear was overwhelming. The forest had tested me in every possible way, and I had endured it, From that trip onward, I never underestimated the wilderness again. I learned to respect its beauty and its danger, to prepare meticulously, and to move carefully. The isolation had been intense, the fear real, but ultimately, I had survived through persistence, careful thinking, and attention to every detail. The experience left me with a lasting respect for nature's power and a deep understanding of human resilience in the face of danger. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. I needed a break from everything: work, city noise, constant notifications, and the relentless pressure that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I wanted silence, fresh air, and the feeling of being truly alone, surrounded by nothing but nature. I packed carefully, making sure I had all the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, a portable stove, a map, and a compass. I also brought my backpacking gear: a sturdy pair of hiking boots, warm clothes, rain gear, and a knife that had been in my family for years. The drive to the campsite took longer than I expected. It was early morning, and the sun was just starting to rise, casting an orange glow over the highway. I took the back roads, wanting to avoid traffic and see more of the countryside. The further I went, the quieter it became. Small towns gave way to dense forest, and the occasional farmhouse stood alone in wide fields. I felt a strange mix of excitement and anxiety. It was the kind of quiet that made you notice your own breathing. When I finally reached the trailhead, I parked my car and unloaded my gear. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and it disappeared into thick woods. The smell of wet earth and pine filled the air. I could hear birds chirping, distant water flowing, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I started hiking, keeping a steady pace. My backpack felt heavy, but I welcomed the weight. It made me feel prepared, safe, like I had control over my environment. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, over small streams, and up gentle hills. I stopped occasionally to take pictures, drink water, and enjoy the view. The sun was warm on my back, and a light breeze kept the air fresh. After about 3 hours, I came to a clearing with a small river running through it. The water was clear, and I could see fish swimming lazily among the rocks. I decided this would be my campsite for the night. It wasn't an official site, but it had a flat area large enough for my tent, and there was plenty of dry wood nearby for a fire. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the ground sheet was secure and the stakes were firmly in the soil. I gathered firewood, starting with small twigs and branches before moving on to larger logs. The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the clearing. I made a small fire pit, arranging the stones in a circle and leaving a safe distance from my tent. Once the fire was burning steadily, I cooked a simple meal: instant noodles with some dehydrated vegetables I had packed. The warmth from the fire and the smell of cooking food made me feel at home in the wilderness. As darkness fell, the forest around me came alive with sounds. The wind whispered through the trees, and the river gurgled softly. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear an owl hooting. I felt a shiver run down my spine, not from fear, but from the intensity of being alone in such a vast, wild space. I double-checked my tent, making sure it was zipped tightly, and I placed my knife within reach. I had brought a small flashlight, but I preferred the natural light of the fire for now. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the faint glow of the fire outside the tent. Every crackle of wood sounded amplified in the silence. I kept thinking I heard footsteps, but every time I unzipped the tent to look, there was nothing. The forest seemed still, yet full of life. I eventually drifted off, but it was a light sleep, filled with half-dreams of movement outside my tent. I woke before dawn to the sound of the river and the rustle of leaves. The forest was dimly lit by early morning light filtering through the trees. I stretched and unzipped my tent to take in the fresh air. The temperature had dropped overnight, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I started a small fire to make coffee and heat some water for breakfast. I ate slowly, savoring the solitude. I froze, thinking about what to do. I had read about bear safety and human-wildlife encounters. I had pepper spray in my pack, and I kept a sturdy stick nearby. I reminded myself to stay calm. I didn't want to provoke anything. I decided to wait, to stay inside the tent, make myself appear small and unthreatening. Hours passed. I lay awake, the sounds moving around me, sometimes close, sometimes further away. My mind kept running scenarios, all of them terrifying. I thought about what I would do if whatever it was decided to come closer. The wind blew, the tent flap rattled, and every small sound made my heart jump. I didn't sleep that night. I just listened. The next morning, I was exhausted, barely able to move, but the sounds of the forest had changed. They were more distant now, and I could see tracks in the mud near the stream. They were big, too big to be a deer. The claws were visible and my stomach sank. I realized it could be a bear or a mountain lion. I had no weapons beyond my small stick and pepper spray. I knew I needed to get out, but the nearest road was several miles away. I packed slowly, carefully, keeping an eye on the tree-line. Every crack of a branch made me tense. I made sure to take down the tent completely, leaving nothing behind. My heart was hammering in my chest as I began the hike back. I stuck to the stream, hoping it would lead me back to the main trail. I moved cautiously, stepping on rocks and soft soil, watching the shadows of the trees. The sun climbed higher, and the forest warmed. I tried to stay calm, but I knew that being nervous could slow me down, make me careless. I imagined the bear, or whatever it was, watching me, calculating. I kept talking to myself, whispering reminders to stay alert, move slowly, stay quiet. I reached a ridge in the mid-morning and saw the road in the distance. Relief flooded me, but I stayed low, careful not to make sudden movements. The forest was silent now, but I knew that silence could hide danger. I kept moving, slower now, more deliberate. My legs were tired. My shoulders ached from carrying the pack, my throat dry from fear and tension. Eventually, I broke through the last line of trees and reached the road. A car passed slowly, its occupants looking at me strangely. I waved, hoping they wouldn't notice my terror, but inside I was shaking uncontrollably. I kept walking until I saw a ranger station. I went straight there. The rangers listened to my story and took me seriously. They noted the tracks, agreed it was likely a large bear in the area, and commended me for staying calm and not provoking it. They advised me never to camp in that spot alone again. They said it was unusual for wildlife to approach humans that closely, but it wasn't unheard of. I filled out a report and left, my nerves raw but grateful to be alive. I didn't go back to that campsite. I didn't even try to revisit the area for months. But after a while, I began to process it differently. The fear, the tension, the awareness of how fragile life can feel in the wild. It taught me something important. I learned to respect the wilderness even more, to prepare, to never underestimate the animals or the environment. I invested in proper bear-proof containers, a reliable GPS, a sturdy trekking pole, and a better first aid kit. I took survival courses. The experience didn't make me afraid of nature, it made me vigilant. Months later, I returned to a different part of the mountains, with better preparation and a small group of experienced campers. We hiked, set up a safe campsite, and spent the night under the stars. The forest was alive as before, but this time I felt in control. The sounds that once terrified me were now familiar, natural, part of the wilderness I had learned to respect. I cooked food over a safe stove, watched the fire flicker, listened to the stream, and slept soundly. The memory of that first night stayed with me for a long time. I remembered the fear, the isolation, the shadow moving in the darkness. But I also remembered how I survived, how careful observation, preparation, and patience allowed me to walk out of a dangerous situation alive. It wasn't luck, it was awareness and respect for the wild. That lesson stayed with me, and every camping trip afterward, I carried it quietly, a constant reminder that the wilderness is beautiful, but it is also real, and it can be dangerous if you forget that. Camping, I realized, is not just about peace and escape. It is about understanding, humility, and preparedness. I never took the forest for granted again. I learned that the real horror isn't in imagined ghosts or tales. It's in the real, raw, unpredictable power of nature. And when you face it wisely, you can survive, you can appreciate it, and you can come back stronger, smarter, and more alive than ever before. I had planned the trip for months. It was a solo camping trip in a remote national forest that few people ever ventured into. I wanted the kind of isolation that made the world feel distant, the kind where the only sounds you heard were wind through the trees, the occasional bird, or the rustling of some small animal in the underbrush. I told myself I wanted a challenge, a test of my preparedness and endurance, but I didn't realize how much I was underestimating the forest itself. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon. My car crunched over the gravel road, leaving a thin cloud of dust that hung in the air before settling. I could see the outline of the forested ridges against the dimming sky, the sun already beginning its slow descent, coloring the clouds in streaks of orange and pale pink. I parked and double-checked my gear. Backpack, tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra food, water purification tablets, flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I had overpacked in some ways, but in the wilderness I'd always heard, it's better to have too much than too little. The trail was narrow, winding along the side of a ridge, and already I could feel the shift in the air as I moved deeper into the forest. The wind had dropped, and everything seemed quieter, more concentrated. My boots crunched over dead leaves and broken twigs as I made my way uphill. I tried to take note of landmarks as I went. An oddly shaped pine, a large rock that jutted out toward the path. But the deeper I went, the more uniform everything started to look. The forest seemed endless, a mass of green and brown, the sun now fully behind the horizon, leaving a dim blue light that barely reached the forest floor. By the time I found what I thought was a suitable spot for my camp, it was nearly dark. I chose a small clearing, flat and clear of large rocks and roots, surrounded by dense trees that formed a natural barrier from the wind. I unpacked and set up my tent quickly. The practice from previous trips helped. My fingers were numb from the cool evening air, but I managed to get the stakes in the ground and the tent taut enough to withstand a breeze. I arranged my sleeping bag and gear inside, placing my food in a plastic container away from the tent, something I had learned after reading too many reports about bears and other wild animals. Once the tent was secure, I decided to collect some firewood. I didn't want a huge blaze, just enough to stay warm and keep the immediate area around the tent illuminated. I found small dry branches and kindling and piled them in a circle with stones I gathered nearby. Lighting the fire was easy with my lighter and a few small shavings of wood. The flames flickered, casting shadows that danced across the surrounding trees. It should have been comforting, but instead, the isolation felt heavier in the dim light. Night in the forest is unlike anything in a town or city. It is not just dark. It is a presence, heavy and suffocating. The trees loom like silent sentinels. The shadows seem to shift and move with a life of their own, and every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves becomes amplified, echoing in a way that makes it impossible to ignore. I tried to convince myself that everything I heard was just small animals, the wind, or branches settling. But there was a tension in my chest, a gnawing awareness that in a place like this, even a small misstep could be dangerous. I cooked a small meal on my portable stove, instant noodles with some dried vegetables and jerky. The aroma was comforting, the warmth from the stove seeping into my hands as I ate. I cleaned up carefully, burying any scraps, knowing the forest could smell anything edible from miles away. With the meal finished, I sat by the fire, letting the warmth soak into my body. The forest was silent except for the occasional owl or distant howl of some unknown animal. I decided to sleep early. The cold was creeping into my bones, and I needed rest for the long day of hiking I had planned for tomorrow. I crawled into the tent, zipped it up, and adjusted my sleeping bag around me. The fire outside dimmed as I drifted off, and for a while, everything was quiet. The second night brought a new layer of tension. Around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of snapping twigs outside the tent. My heart jumped, and I froze listening. The snapping continued in short bursts, moving slowly around my campsite. I could hear heavy breathing, or at least sounds that resembled it. I knew it could have been a large animal circling, maybe trying to test whether I was a threat or if food was available. I tried to calm myself, breathing slowly and reminding myself that animals usually avoid humans. Still, sleep became impossible. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in the tent, clutching my knife, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heartbeat. At dawn, I peeked outside cautiously. The ground around my tent was littered with broken branches and flattened pine needles, but there were no tracks directly leading to me. The creek water, however, now had more debris, and I noticed faint footprints on the muddy bank that matched some of the larger impressions I had seen the day before. I understood then that I had likely been encircled by a bear, or possibly a large moose, but the prints and claw marks suggested bear. My stomach sank. Being close to such a large predator without immediate escape options was frightening, but I reminded myself that panic would only make things worse. I had to stay calm, think strategically, and wait for daylight. I spent the day preparing for a possible encounter. I constructed a rudimentary barrier with logs around my tent, making it harder for a bear to approach directly. I reinforced my food storage, ensuring it was as high and as secure as I could make it. I remained near the creek, both as a source of water and as a place where I could potentially see the animal before it saw me. Every movement, every sound, felt magnified. I started noticing subtle things I had previously overlooked: the tracks of small animals, the rustle of leaves as birds shifted branches, the occasional distant roar of a river. By the third night, I had barely slept, and the tension weighed heavily on me. The snapping of twigs returned, but this time closer, louder, more deliberate. I realized that the bear was aware of my presence, possibly curious, maybe even frustrated that food was inaccessible. My tent felt like a fragile barrier, a flimsy line between safety and chaos. I considered my options carefully. Leaving at night was out of the question. Moving quietly could provoke the animal. I decided the best course was to wait for the first light and move cautiously downstream, following the creek where I could see more clearly and maintain a natural barrier between myself and the bear. At dawn, I packed everything quickly but carefully, ensuring I left no traces that would attract the animal after I moved. I avoided stepping directly on footprints or breaking branches unnecessarily. The forest was eerily silent, as though the bear was watching me from the shadows. I kept my eyes constantly scanning, my ears attuned to every small noise. After about an hour of careful hiking, I reached a narrow section of the creek where fallen trees formed a natural path. This area offered some protection, visibility, and a sense of control. I moved along this path slowly, methodically, making sure my movements were deliberate. Eventually, I emerged from the dense forest onto a wider, more open trail. The bear was nowhere in sight, and I cautiously allowed myself to exhale, though my muscles remained tense. I followed the trail for several hours, constantly scanning for signs of the animal or other dangers. By midday, I reached a ranger station I had marked on my map as a backup safety point. The sight of a human presence, even at a distance, was overwhelming in its relief. I approached slowly, waving arms cautiously to signal my presence. A ranger noticed me, and soon I was safely within a controlled environment. I explained nothing. There was no need for conversation. My body was exhausted, but the relief was profound. Reflecting on the experience afterward, I realized that the forest was indifferent to me, and yet its power was undeniable. Every small decision, where to step, what to pack, how to store food, when to rest, carried immense consequences. My awareness of surroundings, careful planning, and respect for the environment had kept me safe. I knew I had been lucky. A few missteps, a moment of panic, or a misjudgment could have been fatal. The fear I experienced was raw and real, not born of fantasy, but of the inherent dangers in wild, untamed nature. In the end, I returned home with a profound respect for the wilderness and a reinforced understanding of my own limits. I documented every detail: the landscape, the weather patterns, animal signs, and my own physical and emotional responses. I shared the story with a small group of friends and local survival enthusiasts, not as a tale of heroism, but as a realistic example of preparation, observation, and caution. The trip had been terrifying at times, but it had a clear conclusion. I survived because I stayed calm, respected the environment, and never underestimated the power of the wild. The forest remained untamed, beautiful, and indifferent, and I had left it with knowledge, experience, and gratitude rather than fear. I had been planning this camping trip for months, carefully picking a trail that was remote but not completely unknown. I wanted the kind of solitude where the only sounds were wind in the trees, the rustle of small animals, and my own breathing. I was confident, or maybe foolishly confident, thinking that a week alone in the woods would be relaxing, maybe even meditative. I had my backpack meticulously packed: tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, enough food for a week, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, fire-starting tools, and my survival knife. I had double-checked everything, making lists, and packing and repacking until I felt nothing could go wrong. The first day was perfect. I arrived at the trailhead in the late morning, the sun warm on my shoulders. I started hiking along a narrow dirt path that twisted through thick pine forest. Birds called overhead, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine resin. The path climbed steadily, and I felt a healthy burn in my legs as I walked, the weight of my pack firm against my shoulders. I took regular breaks, drinking water and checking my map. The trail was well marked, and for a while, I saw no one. I felt an exhilarating sense of freedom. By the second day, I had reached a small clearing near a stream that would serve as my first campsite. I set up my tent carefully, hammering stakes into the firm ground and tying the rainfly tight. Even though the sky was clear, I boiled water, ate a small meal, and then spent hours just sitting on a rock by the stream, watching the water ripple over stones. That evening, I built a small fire, careful to keep it contained. The firelight flickered against the trees, and I felt a peaceful isolation that I hadn't experienced in years. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant calls of night birds. I slept well that night, wrapped in my sleeping bag, lulled by the cool night air and the distant rushing of the stream. The next morning, I woke to a dense fog settling over the clearing. It made everything seem unreal, the forest muted and gray. I broke camp, packed my gear, and continued on the trail, which climbed higher into the hills. The trail narrowed, and the trees became thicker, their roots snaking across the path. It was slower going than I had anticipated, but I didn't mind. The isolation was exactly what I had wanted. I felt alert and alive, noticing small details: the scuttle of a squirrel, the glint of sunlight on wet leaves, the smell of moss and decomposing leaves. By the third day, I had traveled far from any signs of civilization. I decided to make camp near a small pond I found tucked into a valley. I set up my tent again, gathering dry wood for a fire. As I worked, I noticed broken branches and footprints in the mud near the pond. At first, I assumed they were deer or other wildlife. The prints were irregular, and I couldn't make them out clearly. Still, I was cautious, remembering the survival tips I had read about staying aware of my surroundings. I made my fire, cooked my dinner, and sat quietly, listening to the wind rustle the leaves. I slept lightly that night, occasionally waking to the noises of the forest: the croak of frogs, the splash of something in the pond, the distant crack of a branch breaking. It was the fourth day that the sense of unease began to grow. I had hiked further into the hills, the terrain becoming steeper and more treacherous. My water supply was running low, so I carried a heavy bottle from the pond I had camped near, treating it with purification tablets. The path became less defined, often disappearing beneath fallen leaves or narrow brush. I had to use my compass more than my map, which made me feel both exhilarated and nervous. I felt completely alone, the kind of isolation where every sound seems louder, every shadow deeper. As I climbed higher, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees and rattling branches. I found a small clearing on a ridge and decided to make camp earlier than usual, sensing that the weather might turn. I set up my tent, but the soil was rocky and uneven, and the stakes didn't hold as firmly as I would have liked. I anchored them as best I could, using rocks to secure the corners. The temperature dropped sharply once the sun went down, and I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, shivering despite my layers. That night, sleep was difficult. The wind howled through the ridge, and I imagined the trees swaying dangerously. I woke several times to the sound of branches cracking, my heart racing each time. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat by the fire as it dwindled, occasionally scanning the dark forest with my flashlight. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. The morning brought more clarity, though. Tracks, fresh human footprints in the soft mud near the river, leading upstream. They weren't large, but definitely human. My stomach sank. I didn't know who else could be out here, and the forest was so remote that I hadn't seen another soul for hours. The thought of encountering someone in these conditions made me uneasy, but I rationalized that maybe it was just another hiker like me, someone who had wandered off trail. Still, I decided to pack up and move a little further away, deeper into the forest, just in case. Better to be cautious. The next few hours were tense. Every sound put me on edge, and I found myself checking behind me constantly. I tried to focus on the beauty around me, the sunlight filtering through the trees, the occasional deer grazing at a distance, but the fear gnawed at me. Around noon, I reached a section of the river that was narrower and steeper, with rocks slick from constant moisture. I carefully crossed, one boot at a time, gripping a sturdy branch for balance. When I finally made it across, I found a slightly larger clearing surrounded by thick pine and oak. It was perfect for setting up camp, with plenty of dry wood nearby. I pitched my tent again, exhausted but relieved to have a new, seemingly safe location. I made a fire and ate another small meal, trying to shake the lingering tension from the morning. As the day faded into evening, I decided to explore a little upstream, curious about the terrain. I followed the river, careful to keep my balance on slippery rocks and wet logs. The forest grew denser, and the river deeper and faster. The sound of rushing water mixed with the forest sounds, creating an almost hypnotic background noise. But then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Another set of footprints, this time larger, more deliberate, heading downstream toward my new campsite. They were too large to be mine, and the pattern suggested someone had been walking slowly, watching. Panic rose in my chest. I ran back to my tent, keeping low and quiet, every snapping twig sounding like a warning. When I reached my campsite, everything seemed in place. My tent intact, my fire pit cold, but the prints in the mud confirmed my fear. Someone had been here recently. The night was the worst. I stayed inside the tent, flashlight on, knife close. Every rustle made me flinch. The wind picked up, sending branches scraping against the tent, and every time I heard a crunch outside, my pulse raced. I refused to make a fire, afraid it might attract whoever or whatever was nearby. Hours passed like this, dark and tense. Sleep came only in short, uneasy bursts, interrupted by every sound. The forest felt alive with unseen watchers, shadows, and possibilities. Morning could not come soon enough. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I cautiously emerged from the tent. My firewood was scattered, as if someone had rifled through it. My heart sank. I packed everything quickly, leaving as few traces as possible, and kept moving downstream along the river, staying alert for footprints or any signs of another person. Hours later, I found a faint trail, a real hiking trail maintained and marked. Relief washed over me. I followed it quickly, staying vigilant. Eventually, I reached a small ranger station, the first human presence I had seen in almost 2 days. I explained my situation, and they assured me the forest was usually safe but did get occasional hikers who wandered off trail. They took my details and offered to guide me to a safer section of the forest to retrieve my gear later. I accepted immediately, grateful to be around others. I retrieved my pack and other belongings later that day, but I was careful to stay on marked paths, never venturing near the first spots I had camped. The experience left me shaken, constantly aware of how alone and vulnerable a person can be in the wilderness. But it also left me more prepared, cautious, and respectful of the rawness of nature and the unpredictability of other people. I learned that isolation is both beautiful and dangerous, and that preparation, awareness, and a healthy dose of caution are essential when you step into the wild. The forest was still beautiful, still peaceful in many ways, but I understood now that peace could be deceptive, that shadows and silence could hide much more than just animals. I came home with a deep respect for the wilderness and a renewed sense of humility. And though I returned many times to camp in safer, more populated areas, I never forgot that first night. The fear, the tension, and the lessons it taught me about survival, observation, and the unpredictable nature of being truly alone. I had planned this trip for months. I wanted a long weekend in the mountains, away from the noise and the lights and the constant hum of the city. My car was packed with all the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, food, water, a small first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a folding stove, and some maps of the area. I didn't plan to hike much. This was a camping trip, not a trek. I just wanted to sit, watch the forest, breathe the air, and feel small under the tall trees. I had been camping before, but never alone. That was part of the appeal. The drive was long, twisting along narrow roads that climbed steadily upward. The trees got taller and thicker, and the air smelled different the higher I went. It was damp, earthy, and sharp with the scent of pine. I passed a few other cars, people heading in the same direction, but most of the way I was alone. I had a playlist ready, but after a while, I turned the music off. I wanted to listen to the wind through the trees, the occasional bird, the soft rustle of leaves. I found the campsite late in the afternoon. It was small, tucked into a slight hollow with a stream running nearby. The place looked unused, almost hidden, like it hadn't been touched in years. That was perfect for me. I pulled in, checked the area for any immediate hazards. Unstable trees, steep drops, anything dangerous, and decided it was safe enough. I parked, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent. It was quiet except for the sound of the stream, and I felt the kind of relief I hadn't felt in months. Once the tent was up, I set up my small stove and made some food. Nothing fancy, just some instant noodles and a can of beans. I ate slowly, enjoying the silence, the way the air felt cooler as the sun sank behind the ridges. I noticed the shadows of the trees lengthening, their shapes stretching like fingers across the ground. I reminded myself it was just my imagination. There was nothing here but the forest, the water, the wind. After eating, I decided to walk a little. I wanted to stretch my legs and explore. I followed the stream upstream, stepping carefully on slippery stones. The water was clear, running over rocks and through fallen branches. The smell of wet moss was strong, and I realized how much I had missed the smell of untouched nature. I walked for maybe an hour, keeping track of landmarks so I could find my way back. Eventually, I turned around and headed back to the tent as the light started to fade completely. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag and listened. The forest was alive with sounds I didn't notice during the day. Leaves rustling, twigs snapping under the feet of animals, the soft gurgle of the stream. Somewhere a bird made a low call. My flashlight sat on the floor of the tent, and I knew I could grab it if anything happened. I reminded myself again, this is normal. Everything I hear is normal. Animals are everywhere, and humans are rare in this spot. Then I heard it, a sound that froze me in place. First, I thought it was the wind. The wind could whistle through trees and branches in strange ways. But this sound was different. It was deliberate, rhythmic, something moving slowly through the underbrush. I strained my ears. Snap, another snap, then another. My stomach tightened. I had been careful when I set up my tent. I thought I had checked the area thoroughly. Still, I couldn't identify what it was. I sat up, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. The sound came closer. It was slow, deliberate, cautious, but getting nearer. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, shining it through the mesh of the tent. The light cut a narrow beam into the darkness. For a few moments, I saw nothing. Then a movement, A shadow, something large, moving through the trees. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe it's a deer, a bear, anything. But I didn't hear the typical rustle of a small animal. This was something heavier. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first. A snapping of twigs, like someone walking cautiously through the forest. My heart rate jumped. I froze, listening. The sound was deliberate, slow, coming closer. My first thought was another camper or hiker, but this trail was remote. It was extremely unlikely anyone else would be here. I reached for my flashlight, trying to calm my shaking hands. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness of the tent, illuminating the thin fabric that separated me from the forest. Outside, shadows shifted in ways that made my stomach churn. I couldn't see anything clearly at first. The rustling stopped and then started again, as though whatever it was had paused to listen. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a deer, a bear, or a raccoon, but something about the sound didn't feel right. It was too cautious, too measured, almost like someone or something was watching me. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Bears usually make noise rummaging through leaves, breaking branches, or growling. If it were a human, what would they be doing out here in the middle of the night? I grabbed my small survival knife and my flashlight, telling myself I was just preparing, that I wasn't afraid. But my pulse was loud in my ears, my hands shaking so badly it was hard to hold the knife steady. I unzipped the tent slightly and peered out. Nothing. The fire was out, leaving the clearing bathed in a faint silvery moonlight. I could see the silhouettes of trees, the uneven ground, but nothing moving. Then, just as I was about to relax, I heard it again. A deliberate snap of a branch from just beyond the clearing. My eyes darted to it, trying to pierce the shadows. I debated my options. I could leave the tent and confront whatever it was, but that seemed suicidal. I could stay inside and wait for daylight, but if it was a human, I was trapped. My instincts told me to make noise, to scare it off, but the idea of drawing attention to myself seemed equally dangerous. I decided to do something in between. I grabbed a small rock and tossed it to the far side of the clearing, hoping the noise would convince whatever it was to move away. The rock landed with a dull thump. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard a quick, sharp rustle, moving away from me. My chest eased slightly, but I stayed awake for the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, listening to every small sound. When dawn finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest looked entirely different in the light. The shadows that had seemed menacing the night before were just trees, the thick foliage casting dark patches on the ground. I searched the perimeter of my camp. There were footprints, large human footprints in the damp earth near the edge of the clearing. They were spaced wide apart, as though whoever had made them was moving quickly. My stomach turned. I had been alone, yet someone had been here. I packed up quickly, leaving nothing behind that could be traced or used to identify me. As I hiked down the trail, I kept my eyes open, scanning for anything unusual. I moved cautiously, every step deliberate. The forest seemed less intimidating in daylight, but my senses were heightened now, every rustle and bird call drawing my attention. I kept my knife within reach, my flashlight ready, and I made mental notes of every landmark I passed. After hours of hiking, I finally reached the forest road where I had left my car. Relief washed over me as I saw it parked where I had left it, dust covering its roof from the previous day. I loaded my gear quickly, double-checking for any signs of disturbance. The road back to civilization seemed longer than before, every bump and turn through the gravel reminding me of the vulnerability I had felt. By the time I reached the nearest town, I was exhausted. I stopped at a small diner, ordered a meal, and sat down, letting the safety of other people wash over me. The encounter in the forest had left me shaken, but I knew I had survived because I had remained calm, observant, and careful. I had respected the wilderness and prepared for its dangers, but more importantly, I had respected the unknown, the presence of another person whose intentions I could not know. That night, in my hotel room, I reflected on the trip. I realized that the scariest part of the forest wasn't darkness, or animals, or even the cold. It was the unknown presence of another human. Someone capable of observing you and moving silently. Someone whose motives you cannot predict. I understood that fear was not something that could be conjured with imagination or stories. It was real, tangible, and survived only through vigilance, preparation, and careful action. I slept deeply that night, feeling the relief of safety, and knowing that I would carry the lesson of that forest with me forever. The wilderness is beautiful, isolating, and unforgiving, but respect and caution could carry you through even the scariest night. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, from the constant buzz of phones and emails, and spend a few days alone in the wilderness. I had read maps, studied trails, checked weather forecasts, and made sure I had all the gear I thought I would need. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, enough food for 4 days, a water filter, a small stove, and extra batteries for my headlamp. I had even packed a first aid kit, knowing that being alone in the wild meant I needed to be extra careful. I was as prepared as I could be, or at least I thought I was. I drove for hours until I reached the trailhead of a national forest that was several hundred miles from the nearest town. The road ended at a small parking lot, and the trail started immediately after. The forest was thick, the kind of place where sunlight barely reached the forest floor, and the trees grew tall and close together. There was a smell of pine and damp earth, and I could hear the sound of birds and insects, though it was muted under the canopy. I parked my car, checked my pack, and started walking. At first, the hike was peaceful. The trail was clear and well-trodden, and I moved quickly. I passed small creeks, moss-covered rocks, and fallen logs, stopping occasionally to take photos or just admire the quiet beauty. By midday, I had hiked several miles and found a small clearing near a stream that looked perfect for setting up camp. It wasn't far from the trail, but it felt secluded, hidden by a natural wall of trees and shrubs. I set up my tent, spread out my sleeping bag, and arranged my gear neatly, taking satisfaction in the order and control of it. The first night was quiet. I cooked a simple dinner of canned beans and rice over my small stove, washed the dishes in the stream, and settled into my sleeping bag as darkness fell. The forest had changed completely at night. The trees became enormous silhouettes, the sounds of nocturnal animals filled the air, and the cold seeped into my bones even through my sleeping bag. I lay awake for a long time, listening to distant owls, rustling leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig. I felt completely alone, and a small knot of anxiety formed in my stomach. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was experienced and nothing bad would happen. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke early. Mist hung low over the stream, and the air was damp and cold. I ate a quick breakfast and decided to explore further into the forest. The trail disappeared into dense trees, and soon I was hiking over uneven ground, climbing over fallen logs and stepping carefully around tangled roots. The deeper I went, the more the forest felt alive in a way I wasn't used to. Every sound seemed amplified: the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the crack of a branch under my own boots. I felt a thrill of excitement and unease. I didn't notice it at first, but as the day wore on, I realized I had lost the trail. There were no markers, no footprints, nothing to indicate the way back. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. Trees, ferns, rocks, and fallen branches stretched endlessly in every direction. I felt a sinking panic begin to build. I had a compass and a map, but the forest was so dense that I could barely see enough to get my bearings. Every direction seemed wrong. By late afternoon, I knew I was in trouble. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find a clearing or a stream that could lead me back to my campsite. The terrain grew rougher, with steep slopes and slippery mud. My boots sank into wet soil, my clothes became soaked with sweat, and my pack felt unbearably heavy. The sun was low, and shadows stretched across the forest, making it even harder to see. I realized I was in a valley surrounded by steep ridges, with no easy path up or down. As night approached, I faced a grim reality. I would have to spend the night here. I found a small area under a cluster of trees and set up my tent as best as I could, though the ground was uneven and rocky. I cooked what little food I had left and drank water from my filter. My hands were shaking, not from cold but from fear and exhaustion. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was trained and I could handle this. But lying in my tent, listening to the forest around me, I felt completely exposed. Every sound seemed close and threatening. I could hear something moving outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and I couldn't tell if it was an animal or just the wind. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night alert, straining to hear anything that might indicate danger. My thoughts were dark and spiraling. I imagined being lost forever, running out of water, being injured and unable to move. I thought about what I had read in survival manuals. Stay put if lost, conserve energy, but every instinct in me screamed to move, to find a way out. By dawn, I was drained and barely able to lift my pack. After breakfast, I decided to explore further. I packed a small day pack with water, snacks, and my compass and set off along the river. The forest was dense, with moss-covered trees and fallen logs creating obstacles along the way. I climbed over rocks and waded through shallow parts of the river. The further I went, the more remote it felt. I noticed signs of wildlife, fresh tracks in the mud, the occasional bird dropping, and claw marks on tree trunks. My sense of adventure was mixed with caution. I reminded myself to pay attention, to avoid accidents, and to stay aware of my surroundings. Hours passed as I wandered through the forest. I was careful to mark my path, leaving small rock stacks and broken branches as subtle markers. At one point, I found an old, abandoned cabin hidden among the trees. It was weathered, with moss covering the roof and broken windows. Curiosity drew me closer, but I didn't enter. I examined it from a distance, noting the structure's decay and imagining its history. Whoever had lived here had clearly left long ago. I continued my hike, making mental notes of landmarks and ensuring I stayed oriented. By late afternoon, I returned to my campsite. The sun was beginning to lower, casting a golden light across the clearing. I refilled my water bottle from the river, careful to filter it with my portable filter, and started preparing for the evening. I built a larger fire this time, using dry logs I had collected earlier. The flames crackled loudly, a comforting sound in the growing darkness. As night fell again, a new sense of unease settled in. It was subtle at first. The wind picking up, shadows shifting in the firelight, distant animal calls that seemed closer than usual. I kept my flashlight and knife within reach, scanning the perimeter of the clearing every so often. Then I noticed something odd: footprints. Not large, but unmistakably human. They were fresh, leading from the edge of the forest toward my campsite, stopping just short of the clearing. My heart started racing, and I realized I wasn't as alone as I thought. I stayed calm, reminding myself to think logically. The footprints could belong to hikers, perhaps someone else camping nearby. But as I checked the direction they came from, there was no path, just thick forest. Whoever had made them had approached silently. My imagination raced, picturing all kinds of scenarios, each one more unsettling than the last. I strengthened the fire, placing extra logs around the perimeter to create a barrier of light and warmth. I kept my knife within reach, ready to defend myself if necessary. Hours passed slowly. Every sound seemed amplified: the river, the wind, the snapping of branches. I felt a growing sense of vulnerability. My tent was small and offered little protection, and I realized that in a remote area like this, help would be hours away. I debated whether to stay or attempt to hike back to civilization in the dark, but I knew that moving without visibility was more dangerous than staying put. I had to be patient, alert, and careful. Around midnight, I thought I heard voices, low murmurs far in the distance. I strained my ears, trying to be certain, but it could have been the wind moving through the trees. I stayed inside my tent, keeping the flap zipped and my eyes on the fire. The firelight danced across the surrounding trees, creating moving shadows that made me jump at every small sound. I realized the safest approach was to stay inside the tent, stay alert, and wait for dawn. When the first light of morning arrived, I unzipped the tent slowly. The forest looked calm and peaceful in the pale light. I could see the footprints clearly now, leading to the edge of the clearing, and I realized they had not returned. Whoever had come near my campsite had left during the night. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering tension. I carefully packed my gear, checking for signs of disturbance or theft, and ensured my supplies were intact. I decided to leave the campsite immediately, sticking to the trail I had come in on. I moved cautiously, constantly scanning the forest. As I hiked, I reflected on the experience. I had felt fear, vulnerability, and isolation more intensely than I ever had before, but I had managed to stay calm and alert. My preparation, awareness, and careful decision-making had kept me safe. I understood something important. Nature is beautiful but unpredictable, and human presence adds another layer of unpredictability. By mid-afternoon, I reached the trailhead. I was exhausted, covered in sweat, mud, and scratches from the underbrush, but I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The experience had been intense, terrifying at times, but also clarifying. I had faced real fear, relied on my instincts, and navigated danger responsibly. I loaded my gear into the car, took a deep breath of the fresh air, and started the drive back home. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. I thought about the forest, the river, the abandoned cabin, and the footprints. I knew I would return someday, but I also knew that the wilderness demanded respect and preparation. The experience had left me with a heightened awareness, a sharper sense of caution, and a deeper appreciation for the quiet, unassuming power of nature. I remember the trip vividly. Though it happened years ago, the memory remains etched in my mind, sharper than any photograph or journal entry could capture. I had planned it alone, my first solo camping experience, out in a national forest far from the usual tourist trails. I had chosen a section that was marked as primitive, meaning no designated campsites, no maintained trails, and very few visitors. The map showed a small river cutting through dense pine and oak, with a narrow dirt path that seemed almost forgotten by anyone but wildlife. I wanted that isolation, the rawness of being alone in the wilderness, away from phones, traffic, and the constant hum of everyday life. I packed meticulously: tent, sleeping bag, a compact stove, plenty of food and water, a first aid kit, my camera, and some basic tools. I even brought an emergency beacon, which I thought would give me some comfort, though I hoped I'd never need it. The hike in was tougher than I expected. The map and GPS had guided me through dense brush and fallen logs, and I constantly had to duck under low-hanging branches or step over uneven roots. By the time I reached the clearing I intended to set up camp, my legs were sore, my boots soaked from crossing a shallow but wide stretch of the river, and my backpack seemed to weigh twice as much as it did at the start. I finally reached a small, flat clearing beside a cluster of tall pine trees, close enough to the river to hear its constant burble. Felt like the perfect spot. I dropped my pack, exhaled heavily, and took in the scene. The forest was alive with sound. Birds calling somewhere above, the constant hum of insects, and the wind whispering through the tall pine needles. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I set up my tent, taking my time to make sure the stakes were secure and the rainfly attached correctly. Though the forecast predicted clear skies, I had learned that weather in these forests could change without warning. I gathered firewood from fallen branches, dry needles, and small twigs, making a neat pile a few feet from my tent. I checked my water filter, boiled some water for dinner, and ate a simple meal of rice and canned vegetables. As the sun began to set, the forest transformed. Shadows lengthened, the temperature dropped, and the comforting sounds of the day shifted to something more unsettling. Small rustlings in the brush, the occasional snap of a distant branch, the low murmur of the river flowing a bit faster. Darkness crept in faster than I anticipated, and I lit a small fire, letting the glow push back the shadows just enough to feel a little safer. That first night was restless. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest, trying to calm my mind. Every sound seemed magnified: the rustle of leaves, a bird calling its night song, the occasional distant thump that I assumed was a deer or other wildlife. I kept my flashlight close and my knife within reach, simple precautions but ones that gave me a sense of control. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a noise that wasn't quite like the others. A repetitive, low crunching sound, as if someone or something was moving slowly but deliberately through the underbrush near the river. My heart raced. I sat up quietly, listening, straining to hear over the sound of the river. It stopped. I held my breath. Then it started again, closer this time, coming from a direction where I had not seen a trail. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent flap, pointing the light toward the noise. Nothing, just shadows moving among the trees. I tried to tell myself it was probably a deer, or a raccoon, or some other animal, but the pattern of the footsteps didn't feel right. Animals are usually unpredictable, jerky, or scattered, but this sounded deliberate, paced, almost human.